Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 20th of January 2016, just after 1 o'clock, and welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson, and joining me today, I'm very pleased to say, we've got Vanessa Beeley. Hello, Vanessa. How's life in France?
Cold. You'll be pleased to hear.
Yes, it's been a bit chilly here as well. Now, of course, we are going to just get straight ahead and start talking about Madaya once again, because the press has been absolutely full of continuing stories of families' fight for survival in Madaya, and Bild here a few days ago saying that the starving hell of Madaya, how the disaster came about, how the world found out about it, why the people are still suffering, how Assad is abusing the rescue of the people under siege for his own propaganda. Surely this is propaganda?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course it is propaganda. Bild, as we know, Julian Robka, who wrote this article, is nicknamed Jihad Julian on Twitter because of his support for fundamentally Islamic State. I mean, I think in one of his most recent tweets, he even said that the Islamist rebel groups, rebel in inverted commas, are the best available solution for Syria. So he's advocating the child killers, the executioners, the crucifiers, the rapists, the murderers, the criminals that have been infiltrated into Syria by our own governments. He wrote this article on the back of various RT articles. Now, Murad Gadziev is actually in Madaya and has been in Madaya since the situation supposedly deteriorated at the beginning of January. And obviously this Bild article was an attempt to discredit the RT information that was coming out of Madaya as propaganda. But in fact, what it does is reveal itself to be pro-NATO, pro-US, pro-Saudi Arabia propaganda. And as we know, he's hardly somebody that we can call reliable or impartial.
But he does actually really just sort of represent a thread which is running through the entire mainstream media at the moment.
Yeah,
is that's
absolutely.
The case? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the case. And I think what we need to do is to maybe try and put Madaya into perspective. If we look at when, I call it the propaganda storm, broke on Madaya, it was the same day, in fact, as the execution of Sheikh al-Nimr, the well-respected and very much loved opposition speaker against Saudi Arabian autocracy and brutality and oppression. Yes, he was, he could be called, he was Shia, but actually he was not really, he didn't put himself forward as a religious cleric. He put himself forward as a teacher, as an activist against oppression and brutality. He was executed on the 2nd of January, and with very little research, what we found was at 11 p.m. on the 2nd of January, Sheikh Abdullah Maisini, who is the Riyadh-educated cleric who came to Syria in 2013 to form the Jaish al-Fatah coalition, which comprises of Jabhat al-Nusra and Ada al-Sham. He calls himself the general judge of Jaish al-Fatah. He launched a Twitter tirade calling on specific Al Jazeera journalists, one of whom, Faisal al-Qasim, had already been advocating the death of Alawites in Syria, and various others within the Al Jazeera media organization, to basically launch the propaganda stream. In other words, he expressed it in one way. He said, look, support Madaya. In other words, he was asking them to come on board with the propaganda. And we know that it was Al Jazeera who pretty much launched with the fake photographs in their various propaganda videos. And those photographs were then picked up by people like Vice, who later withdrew them, the Daily Mail and the national press in the UK, and then globally. And as we were talking this morning, when you do a global search on Madaya, the frightening thing is the number of fake photographs that are still within that search. And at the same time, in fact, 2 hours previously to this, the Times fixer, London Times and Sunday Times fixer and researcher in Zabadani, which is how he describes himself on his Twitter page, launched the Madaya is starving hashtag. So oddly, and we can say this is pure coincidence, but on the very day that Sheikh al-Nimr is executed, which has its own ramifications, both on the predominant ongoing negotiations with Iran to lift sanctions and to reintegrate Iran into the global community, which of course is an anathema to Saudi Arabia, whose arch enemy in the region is Iran, or is perceived to be Iran, and Israel. We have to include Israel in this. And then also we have ongoing peace talks in Geneva at the end of the month. So, you know, we have to see these events as being connected. And even if we look at Sheikh Moussini's influence in the region, we know that previously he's raised millions to arm the Jaish al-Fatah coalition, which is Adar al-Sham and al-Nusra. And his second tweet on Madaya was basically asking for over $1 million to arm Adar al-Sham in order to be able to basically annihilate Kafraya and Fura, that are the Shia villages, although I hate to go with the sectarian narrative, but it's impossible to avoid because it's that is being propagated by the Saudi propaganda. And those two villages, Kafraya and Fura, are under the Jaish al-Fatah coalition siege since March 2015, full siege, and since 2011, partial siege. So we're seeing, one, a launching or a demanding of promotion of the Madaya situation by the Al Jazeera pro-regime change journalists. And we're then seeing a threat, and hardly a veiled threat, a very definite threat against Kafraya and Fura, which again is exacerbating this attack on the Shia factions in Syria, which again will impact upon Iran. So we can't look at any of the situation out of context. That's what I'm trying to say. And then we have to understand that on that basis, why the West has run with this propaganda with very little proof, fake photographs, nobody on the ground. The only reporter on the ground was the RT reporter, Murad Gazdiev. And yet his testimony is being questioned by people who are simply not there. I mean, that's the insanity of this situation.
And indeed, we had a couple of days ago, we had it on the UK Column News. You've posted it on Facebook, the article on the Open Democracy website, where the BBC is discussing using so-called citizen journalists increasingly, and how their newsroom is changing as a result. We'll come on to that a little bit later, perhaps. But I mean, this is yet another typical article here. 5 U.S. citizens trapped in starving Syrian town of Madaya, and there's a video clip about halfway down this, which features this gentleman, and I know you wanted to say something about him.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to, you know, it's very difficult. I was discussing this with somebody yesterday and again on various debates. But yeah, you know, there are so many false flags even being produced at the moment, and it's becoming exhausting to keep up with them. And to a huge extent, I do believe this is part of the sort of creation of a chaos situation, perpetual chaos and ignorance to a huge extent of the real situation on the ground. And what we are seeing here, for instance, is this NBC report from Richard Engel, who allegedly is contacting 5 citizens in Madaya who apparently hold US passports. So again, we're seeing a certain degree of exceptionalism, of course, from US media focusing in on those who are US citizens. But also, if we look at Engel's background, if we go back to 2012, December 2012, where he claimed he was kidnapped along with 4 other journalists within Syria, and he claimed, and he did various media interviews after this, saying that they were pro-Assad Shiite forces who had tortured some of the reporters, who had killed their FSA interpreter and fixer. And this story continued for some time until it was later proven to be false. And the fact was that it was Sunni rebels that had allegedly captured them, who were in allegiance with their liberators. So captors and liberators were working together to produce this propaganda storm. Now, we can say, if we're being charitable, we can say that Engel was an unwitting dupe in this situation, but to then continue with this story with various interviews and so on post the event, when he must have had, in other words, nobody investigated it, nobody asked the questions that were relevant to it, to say, well, how do you know that they were Shia captors, and how do you know it was them that were torturing you? So it has to throw some lack of credibility on any of his reports. And if we actually watch his report, he's contacting this family by Skype. We see no images of the family. We see no images of Madaya itself. He could be talking to anybody.
Now, of course, we have now seen footage of the UN transporting food into Madaya, and one of the questions that needs to be asked is, what is happening to this food? We've got The Guardian a couple of days ago reporting that 5 people starved to death in Madaya despite aid delivery, according to the United Nations. So what is going on here that people seem to be starving after so much food has gone into the country? Surely this demonstrates it's not Assad who is causing the problem here.
It is insane to make this accusation that Assad would be starving his own people. If we consider the fact that this siege of this, Al-Jafri, in his address to the UN shortly after the Madaya storm broke, he made the point that basically the terrorists have 2 categories of siege. One is within the city or village itself, which is the situation in Madaya, where they are being controlled by the Ara, al-Sham, al-Nusra, FSA factions that are actually occupying Madaya. And then we have situations like Kafraya, Deir ez-Zor, which we'll talk about in a bit, even Aleppo, where the terrorist siege is external to the civilian areas and is blocking food and aid from entering those areas. In Madaya, what is happening, and we saw this again in Yarmouk in 2014, the aid is entering with the coordination of the Syrian government and the Syrian Arab Army. We know this is true because when we look back to the 19th of October, the Red Cross spokesperson said that they entered Madaya and they left enough food to last for 2 months. On the 28th of December, the UN were allowed into Madaya and they evacuated 126 injured terrorists. Then in the beginning of January, I think now there's been 2 convoys that have entered Madaya. One yesterday was with 10,000 litres of fuel. And then prior to that, there had been another food delivery, which I think I was told was enough to feed 40,000 people. Again, the exaggeration of the number of people in Madaya, as far as I am aware, there are only about 23,000 civilians in Madaya, whereas we keep hearing the figure of 40,000. That, as far as I am aware from people on the ground, is exaggerated. So enough food was delivered at the beginning of January to suffice 40,000 people. Now, we also hear from, I believe it was from the Red Cross again, that the civilians of Madaya had kicked out the head of the Ara al-Sham faction in Madaya, because he had immediately tried to requisition those food supplies and take them into the terrorist warehouses in order to charge extortionate prices, I think around $250 now for a kilo of rice, to the civilians. So while we're hearing all the time that it's Assad's government that is sieging the town, that is true. But we're in a war situation, and we're in a situation where, as I've described, the Zabadani region is extremely strategically important to the rebels, and we have to here make the connection between Ara al-Sham and al-Nusra with Israel. Israel is known to have taken Ara al-Sham al-Nusra operatives into its hospitals, treat them, and then send them back to Syria. Zabadani is a known Hezbollah stronghold, and it's the main hub for equipment, weapons, logistical equipment to come into Syria to aid the resistance fight against the NATO terrorist hordes that are in Syria. So that gives us an understanding of why this region is so important to those that are intent upon regime change, but also, more importantly maybe, to Israel, because Hezbollah, we know, is a thorn in their side, and it's one that they would very much like to remove. And if they can maintain the rebel presence or the terrorist presence in Madaya and in Zabadani, it makes sense that that would aid their operation against the Hezbollah brigades. Yes, you've put up this image, which is from Yarmouk, but again exemplifies what is happening in Madaya. In Yarmouk, we had exactly the same situation where the Syrian Arab army, although it had Yarmouk under siege because of the rebel factions that were there and that were occupying Yarmouk, they were allowing citizens out of Yarmouk, which again was not reported by the mainstream media. But what we're seeing again in Madaya, and we saw in Yarmouk, is that the rebels or the terrorists are taking the supplies of food and the convoys that come in, hijacking them, and then selling them at extortionate prices. And what this image demonstrates is we see photographs of starving children or starving civilians, but always next to them are really very healthy looking terrorists. Why? Because the terrorists are taking the food and they are withholding it from the citizens. There is absolutely no logjam for humanitarian aid to get through the government siege of Madaya or any other government siege in the area. And that was reiterated by the Red Cross spokesperson, who very clearly said he can get through any government-held area and take humanitarian aid to citizens under siege. He cannot bypass one single terrorist-held area like Kafraya and Fua. And in fact, we see again very recently that there has been reticence on the UN's part to get through to Kafraya and Fua because they claim they're scared of the Ara al-Sham roadblocks on the route into Kafraya and Fua. But we also then have to question, why are they meeting with the same terrorist factions inside Madaya once they've been allowed in by the Syrian government and the Syrian army?
Indeed. Now we have, this seems to be a typical kind of tweet coming out of the area at the moment. Our Sham inside Madaya went hysterical when Al-Alam TV revealed names of militants who sell stolen food aid. So this again, reiterating the allegation that the militants, the terrorists, are stealing the food, keeping it for themselves, selling it at extortionate rates, are the reports that we're getting, and this is indicative of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It exemplifies exactly what I've just said.
Okay, and in the meantime, in Kafaria and Fua, what is, it's the same situation once again?
Yeah. If we look at these images, the first is of Tiny, I think she's a 2-month-old baby who's suffering from extreme malnutrition and cold now. It's incredibly cold, even in Syria. And up until yesterday, the UN had failed to deliver any fuel into Kafraya and Fura, whilst they had obviously delivered into Madaya. One of the reasons that I was told by somebody whose father is the head surgeon in Kafraya is apparently the UN have stated that they are worried that any fuel that they take into Kafraya and Fura might be requisitioned by the Syrian Arab Army that is defending Kafraya and Fura and its citizens against the Ara Sham al-Nusra siege that has been a full siege since March 2015. Prior to that was a partial siege. 1,700 civilians have lost their lives in Kafraya and Fura since 2011, 300 since March 2015. If we look at these images, as I said, the first is of a 2-month-old baby suffering with malnutrition. The second is a little boy, 5-year-old, who has skin cancer, who's been unable, obviously since the siege began, to get the proper nutrients or the medicine that's needed for his condition, and it's ravaging him. The third picture is of a little girl, Fatima al-Noor, I think, certainly Fatima, who died of starvation on the 13th of January. So while the media focus was very much on Madaya, this little girl died completely alone and unmourned by mainstream media because Kafraya and Fura does not serve the NATO, US, Saudi and Israeli propaganda. And this point has to be made. Kafraya and Fura have been under siege for 4 years and are rarely mentioned in the mainstream media.
Of course, the atrocities elsewhere continue. So, but it's one of the main atrocities is the quality of the reporting. Of course, dozens killed, apparently, according to the Guardian. But in fact, the numbers are significantly higher than that.
I mean, this was just diabolical. Basically, in Deir ez-Zor, which has been under terrorist siege for years now, purely because the people in Deir ez-Zor are considered to be loyal to the Syrian government. It's a predominantly Sunni population, which again sort of undermines the propaganda that the Sunnis are under oppression from the predominantly Alawite government, which again is not true, because if we actually look at the government members, the majority of them are Sunni, as are the majority of the Syrian Arab Army, and as are the majority of the citizens of Deir ez-Zor. But I think it was 2 days ago, the terrorists sent in 30 suicide bombers, which decimated civilian populations. They massacred over 280, it's between 280 and 300 civilians were killed, including a 4-month-old baby, elderly men, women, children, and 50 Syrian Arab Army soldiers who have been there defending the city against the terrorist siege. And as you say, the Guardian headline, when you compare it to the sort of dramatic theatrical outrage about Madaya based on very scant information from on the ground, but they were happy to run with that across the board without any further investigation. And yet in this situation, not only is the headline misleading where it says dozens of civilians killed, it then even goes on to say that, well, yeah, the state media states that 300 civilians were killed, but it almost sort of belittles the role of the state media. It also then goes on to disparage the comment from the Syrian Prime Minister, where he basically states this is the responsibility of the NATO and US terrorists that have been allowed to enter Syria and are mass criminals, mercenaries, murderers, and these are the people that have massacred. This is one of the worst massacres in Syria in the almost 5 years war on Syria, and yet it's been completely marginalized by the mainstream media while the propaganda in Madaya continues.
Now, we mentioned earlier that the mainstream media absolutely relying on so-called citizen journalists, and as I said, we mentioned this article from the RB blog on Open Democracy, on the Open Democracy website, how the citizen journalism is transforming the BBC's newsroom practices. What's absolutely clear from this is an acknowledgement that the BBC has no one in the country, and I don't think I remember a war zone where the BBC didn't have, and in fact all British news outlets didn't have people on the ground to actually see what was going on, and so they are relying on various individuals and Skype and Twitter and so on to build their picture of what's going on. So how can they possibly get an accurate picture under those circumstances?
They can't, and we know. I mean, we discussed this morning. The donors and backers of Open Democracy are the usual suspects, including Open Society Foundation, George Soros. You know, it's as I've discussed recently, if we look at every single activist, citizen journalist based in Syria, used by the mainstream media to supply information on events on the ground in Syria, they are all anti-Syrian government and by default anti-Syrian people. They are all, or many of them, come from the agitprop shop that was set up by Avaz in 2011 with public donations of over 1 million to establish a propaganda ring within Syria, of which Dani Abdul Dayam was part, Rami Jarrah, who's now reporting regularly from on the ground in Aleppo in particular. We'll talk a little bit more about both of them in a minute. But this entire propaganda ring was set up right back in 2011 when the alleged peaceful revolution, which has been discredited time and time again, started. And these type of citizen journalists have been funded, supplied with camera equipment, communications equipment, logistical equipment by funds raised by Avaz. And we know that the majority of the primary NGOs whose people on the ground in Syria supply that information, like, for instance, the White Helmets, SNHR, SOHR, physicians, doctors, medics under fire, that's the one, sorry. We can trace all of their roots back to Soros funding. So immediately this must put into question their evidence. It must be then perceived that they cannot be considered impartial or neutral observers on the ground. When do we ever hear any of these mainstream media outlets talking to somebody who is pro-Syrian government? We never hear it. So how are we getting a balanced view on the ground? None of us can say that any government, globally, is perfect. But surely, if we are showing or demonstrating a balanced view of any particular conflict, we should be talking to both sides, and yet we never do it. Dr. Al-Jafri, who's the permanent Syrian representative at the UN, is constantly marginalized, even down to the fact where his microphone is cut quite often when he's speaking in the UN. So we see total marginalization of one side of the narrative and complete amplification of the other side of the narrative, which is obviously always pro-regime change and anti-Syrian government.
But you make a really key point here in that, because, of course, we've got this article now acknowledging the use of citizen journalists by the BBC, but in the case of Syria, this has been the case right from the very beginning. Yeah,
absolutely. And if we go back to Dani Abdul Dayam, which I think everybody kind of knew him by his nickname, Syrian Dani, down to his fake report for CNN where he was exposed as basically being in a studio, kind of faking reporting of bombing and shelling. Which,
well, let's just run through the history of these two guys. So we've got Danny and Rami appearing in Syria at around 2011. I mean, this is a very basic timeline. You can fill this out if you wish. They're both working from 2011 with the BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN, Al Arabiya, and 2012 they're both working with Avaz. Danny on the smuggle hope into Syria campaign, and Rami on the alleged rescue of foreign journalists. We can talk about that in a second, briefly. March 2012, as you say, Syrian Danny confronted by CNN over the fake video, and he seems to have taken a back seat from this point on, more or less. But Rami continues with the BBC interview. I think that was Jeremy Paxman in 2012, and then back working with Avaz in September 2013. And so these are typical of the types of people that are being used by the mainstream media.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we look back, as I say, when Avaz set up this in inverted commas citizen journalist network in Syria in 2011, Rami Jarrah and Danny Abdeldayem were integral parts, along with somebody called Wissam Tarif, who was very much their campaign manager. Rami Jarrah, from what I can understand, was very much a spy and a smuggler. It was him, from what I can understand, who managed to get the Sunday Times journalist Mary Colvin and her colleagues into Syria. And if you remember, she was killed in a shelling attack in Homs. But those journalists entered Syria illegally, i.e., they entered without visas. So they entered without the knowledge of the Syrian government, which, if we consider somebody doing that in the UK or in Europe, one, the government cannot be held responsible for their safety within that country. And two, one must ask why they feel the need to be smuggled in by citizen journalists who are known agitators against the Syrian government. So again, even from the very early days, we're seeing a heavy bias towards anti-Syrian movements as opposed to being pro the Syrian people or even listening to the Syrian people, who even, according to polls pre-2011, were in the majority pro-Assad. So, we're utterly reducing the Syrian people's self-determination in the way that the Western media is portraying the situation on the ground. If we also take the case of Rami Jarrah and Danny Abdeldayem, we know that Danny Abdeldayem was he produced fake reports. But interestingly, when we see the two timelines in parallel, there was a BBC report in August 2011 by Alexander Page, who was Rami Jarrah's pseudonym then, describing the alleged Syrian Navy shelling of Latakia, the coastal town. Now, this story has been proven by people on the ground in Latakia, by various reports, including by Sharmin Nawani, who was on 21st Century Wire this Sunday, to be false. So while Rami Jarrah has slightly avoided association with Danny Abdeldayem, we still have to see the parallels, because he was quite happy to give credibility to this story without any investigation, to reproduce it on a CNN report in the same way that Danny Abdeldayem had been doing prior to that. He also produced reports of anti-government rallies in Damascus, which he later undermines himself in a later interview where he said, well, no, it wasn't possible to have anti-government rallies in Damascus. Again, fake footage was used. They took footage from Hama and they used it as Damascus footage on the CNN report. So, you know, like when we actually look back, when we look at how Rami Jarrah and Dani Abduldaim run in parallel, even down to the fact that at the end of 2011, Rami Jarrah fled to Cairo and he set up Anna Press. But Dani Abduldaim also fled to Cairo around the same time, and he states in one interview that he was working in an activist operations room in Cairo. Now, again, you could say this is speculation, but it's a very odd coincidence that they both flee to Cairo at the same time. Dani describes himself as working in an activist operations room, whereas Rami describes himself as doing the same thing, but then says that he sets up Anna Press. Anna Press, by the way, which he claims to be completely neutral, non-government funded, no affiliations with any government agencies. When we dig a little bit deeper on that, it's connected to both HIVOS and CEDA. And when we look at their funding, guess who we find, yet again, is George Soros.
Yeah.
Wissam Taraf, who was the campaign manager for Abbas in Syria and one of their most vociferous anti-government propagandists, his NGO that he is associated with is an NGO in Spain called INSAN. When you go to INSAN's website, the email address is to INSAN Lebanon. And when you look at the funding of INSAN Lebanon, guess who you find again? You know, Open Society Foundation. So what we have to be looking at here is, rather than dealing with every single false flag as it arises, we have to consider who these mainstream media outlets like the BBC, like The Guardian, like The Telegraph, who they are relying upon. And in the main, they are relying upon people like the SNHR, SOHR, who we know to be EU funded, and people like Rami Jarrah, a supposedly independent journalist on the ground, who is nevertheless being funded by George Soros. So George Soros is controlling this propaganda ring in Syria.
Okay, well, look, we're into our last few minutes here. So one person that you mentioned earlier, but you wanted to highlight, was Dr. Bashar al-Jafari, who's the permanent representative to the United Nations for Syria.
Yeah.
He gave a speech a couple of days ago.
Yeah, he gave a speech on Madaya, and I would recommend to anybody who wants a measured and extremely diplomatic view on the situation in Syria to follow Dr. al-Jafari. He's the permanent Syrian representative at the UN. There are a number of his speeches on YouTube. But the very important point that he made, and one that I think we need to reinforce here today, is that he said, basically, regardless of all the figures that are being produced of who is sieging who, he said, look, 23 million Syrians are under siege by hostile governments and hostile media and the NGO propaganda rings, who are criminals, who are allowing criminals and murderers into Syria to besiege the situation. If you add to that the brutal economic sanctions that affect civilians in Syria, 1,441 factories in Aleppo were dismantled and taken to Turkey. Very few people are aware of this situation. Very few people are also aware of the essential infrastructure damage that has been done by the US coalition bombing of essential infrastructure, oil, electrical services, bakeries, water plants. On the 3rd of January this year, there was a water plant bombed in Raqqa, which completely deprives the people of Raqqa, that is under siege by ISIS, from clean water.
And of course, this was the same type of thing that was going on in Libya.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a complete decimation of the essential infrastructure of a sovereign nation. And what that allows the interventionists or the imperialists to say is, well, look, the government is depriving its people of clean water, of food, of humanitarian supplies, while they are happily bombing any sort of support for the government and the people within that country. In Aleppo last year, the thermal power plant was bombed, which obviously cut electricity to the area. We see it all the time. We saw the coalition strikes on Al-Bab in Aleppo, which they knew to be a prison that was keeping Aleppan civilians in it by ISIS terrorists, and yet they bombed it. So they massacred civilians, and yet Congress kept this very quiet. It wasn't released into the mainstream media. The other thing that Dr. Al-Jafri made very clear is when the Syrian government has liberated areas, like, for instance, Homs, the humanitarian situation improves drastically. And that is proven. It's proven. When you watch the scenes of jubilation at the liberation of Homs, this completely flies in the face of the Western propaganda. And it's this that we must be wary of marginalizing and ignoring.
Okay, look, Vanessa, we're just about out of time, so I'm going to say thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to continue this conversation in the coming weeks, and hopefully we'll have a very special guest on next week, but we'll let people know about that very shortly. Just before we go, we'll mention, because you mentioned Sharmeen Nawani, so we'll mention that she was on with Patrick Henningsen on the Sunday Wire last Sunday. Please go to 21st Century Wire and have a listen to that. I think you said she comes on sometime around 50 minutes in. Is that correct?
59:29, I think it is.
Right.
To be exact.
So for the second hour. Okay. Well, look, brilliant. Once again, thank you very much for joining us, Vanessa. Thanks to everyone watching, and we'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.